The first sign that her world was being dismantled wasn't a letter or a phone call, but a sign itself. A bright, garish orange sign staked into the perfect emerald green of her lawn, like a flag claiming conquered territory. Foreclosure auction, July 18th, 10 a.m. Clara Abernathy, age 67, stood at her kitchen window, a bone china teacup suspended halfway to her lips. She did not drop the cup. She did not gasp. She simply stood there, the early morning California sun warming her face through the glass, and watched the world outside her window fracture into a million unrecognizable shards. The man who had planted the sign, a young fellow in a too-tight polo shirt, tipped his hat to her with a smirk before climbing back into his truck. He thought she was just another little old lady, probably confused, definitely defeated. He had no idea he'd just lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite that had been sitting, patiently waiting, for 30 years. Clara placed the teacup back on its saucer. The delicate clink was the only sound in the immense, sun-drenched silence of the house. She walked back straight to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the wide veranda. The lavender bushes that flanked the porch steps released their sweet, calming scent into the air, a scent that had always been her anchor. It was the scent of her life's work. She looked at the sign. She looked at her lavender fields, row upon row of majestic purple stretching all the way to the old oak tree at the property line. This was not just a house. This was Abernathy Lavender Estates. This was the brand she had built from a single struggling plant into a multi-million-dollar empire of artisanal oils, soaps, and lotions, coveted from Napa to New York. This was the land her husband Thomas had bought for her with a promise. This was the home where she'd raised their daughter, Sarah. This was everything, and it was being taken from her. She knew why, of course. She wasn't senile. The letters from the bank had started 6 months ago, polite at first, then increasingly stern. The financial crash had been like a slow-moving poison, and her business, though resilient, had not been immune. Orders from high-end spas and boutiques had dwindled. Then came the catastrophic hailstorm that had decimated half of last year's crop. The insurance payout had been a joke. She'd taken a loan to replant, to keep her staff employed, to keep the lights on. A loan from Silicon Valley United Bank, personally guaranteed by her, with this property as collateral. She had thought she could outrun it. She'd launched a new line, Lavender Noir, for evening wear. She'd been in talks with a major European distributor. She'd been fighting, but the clock had run out. She walked down the steps, her hand trailing along the smooth, sun-warmed wood of the railing her husband had built. She stopped in front of the offensive orange sign. She didn't yank it out of the ground. That would be petty. That would be an act of futile anger. Clara Abernathy did not do futile. She did calculated. A name surfaced in her mind, cool and smooth as a river stone. Robert Carson, CEO of Silicon Valley United Bank, the man whose signature was on the final foreclosure notice, the man who had, 3 decades ago, been her husband's best friend and business partner, the man who had, with a few deft strokes of a pen and a web of lies, stolen Thomas's half of their fledgling tech startup, leaving him bankrupt, humiliated, and broken. Thomas had never recovered. The light in his eyes, the brilliant entrepreneurial spark that had drawn her to him, had been extinguished. He died of a heart attack 5 years later, a quiet, defeated man, still wondering how his best friend could have done it. They'd been left with nothing but this plot of land, a wedding gift from her parents, which Robert's lawyers hadn't been able to touch. It was here they had come to start over. It was here Thomas had died. And now Robert Carson was finishing the job. He was taking the land too. Clara felt a coldness settle in her chest, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Grief was a fog, rage was a fire, but this was something else. This was the pure, crystalline focus of a master jeweler examining a flawed diamond. She turned her back on the sign and walked inside. She went to the study, Thomas's old study. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and old books. She sat at the heavy oak desk and booted up her computer. Her fingers, gnarled slightly with arthritis but still nimble, flew across the keyboard. She wasn't a Luddite. She'd built a modern business. She understood the modern world. She began her research. Robert Carson was not a hard man to find. He was a pillar of the Bay Area community now, philanthropist, patron of the arts. His face, tanned and perpetually smug, smiled from the websites of countless charities. He lived in an enormous glass and steel monstrosity in Atherton. He was married to his third wife, a woman named Chloe, who was younger than Clara's daughter. He had a son, Evan, from his first marriage, who was now being groomed to take over the bank. Clara's lips curled into a thin smile. So, the empire was to have an heir. How traditional. She dug deeper into the financial news, the business gossip columns, the society pages. Robert was powerful, but he was also arrogant. He loved the spotlight. He gave interviews boasting about his ruthless business acumen, his killer instinct, his ability to see opportunity where others see risk. In one particularly nauseating profile in Forbes, he'd even referenced his early days, talking about how he'd learned from his first venture that sentimentality has no place in business. Clara's blood ran cold. He was talking about destroying Thomas. Her plan began not as a detailed blueprint, but as a feeling, a sense of rightness. This wasn't just about saving her home. This was about balance. This was about justice. A bank foreclosure was a cold, impersonal thing. What she needed was something deeply, exquisitely personal. She needed to ruin Robert Carson the way he had ruined Thomas, not just financially, but completely. She needed to dismantle the edifice of his life, brick by arrogant brick, until nothing was left but the weak, pathetic man she knew was hiding underneath. She needed to play a long game, and she had exactly 63 days until the auction. The first move was to buy time. She called her lawyer, a weary but kind man named Ben Jacobs. "Ben, they put a sign on my lawn," she said, her voice steady. He sighed. "Clara, I've tried everything. They won't budge. The loan is in default. The collateral is cold. It's a straightforward contract." "I understand that," Clara said, looking out the window at the lavender swaying in the breeze. "But there's a procedural error." "What error?" "The notice of default? It was sent via certified mail, but the tracking number they provided in the court filing shows it was delivered to a P.O. box in Salinas, not my physical address. California Civil Code 2924B is very specific about the requirements for proper service. It's invalid." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Clara," Ben said, his voice filled with a new respect. "How on earth did you know that?" "I read, Ben," she said mildly. "I also have a cousin in Salinas. It's not a coincidence. File the motion for improper service. It will stall them for at least 45 days. It worked. The auction was postponed. It was a temporary stay of execution, but it was all she needed. Now, for the real work, she needed to understand Robert's world. She needed an in. Her eyes fell on a society page announcement. The Carson Foundation's annual summer gala. A Midsummer Night's Dream theme. Black tie, benefiting Bay Area arts education. It was perfect. A crowd. A theme. A chance to observe him in his natural habitat. But she couldn't just buy a ticket. She needed to be part of the scenery. She spent the next week on the phone, calling in a lifetime's worth of favors. Clara Abernathy might have been a recluse for the past decade, but the Abernathy lavender brand had friends. She finally connected with Marguerite Duval, the formidable director of the San Francisco Ballet, a woman whose skin had been saved from a terrible bout of dermatitis years ago by Clara's unscented, hypoallergenic lavender salve. "Marguerite, ma chérie," Clara said, slipping into the fluent French she'd learned from her Parisian grandmother. "I have a proposition." An hour later it was settled. Abernathy Lavender would be an official last-minute sponsor of the gala. They would provide exquisite, hand-sewn lavender sachets as party favors for every guest a touch of authentic local luxury. And of course, Clara herself would need to attend to oversee the presentation. The night of the gala, Clara looked at herself in the full-length mirror in her bedroom. She had not worn an evening gown in over a decade. The dress was a simple column of deep aubergine silk, the color of her lavender at twilight. She wore a single piece of jewelry, the antique amethyst pendant Thomas had given her for their 10th anniversary. Her silver hair was swept up in an elegant chignon. She looked every inch the dignified, slightly eccentric businesswoman, not a vengeful fury. It was the perfect disguise. The Carson estate was everything she'd expected and worse, a monument to cold, expensive taste. Guests spilled out onto manicured lawns where hired actors flitted about as fairies and sprites. It was pretentious and ridiculous. And then she saw him. Robert Carson stood near a champagne fountain, holding court. He was heavier now, his jawline softened by good living, but his eyes were the same, a pale, watery blue that missed nothing. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that seemed to suck the air out of the room around him. His arm was draped around the waist of his wife, Chloe, a stunningly beautiful woman in her 30s who looked bored out of her mind. Clara felt a tremor of pure hatred so intense it made her fingers shake. She clutched her beaded purse tighter and forced herself to breathe in, out, drawing on the calming scent of the lavender corsage pinned to her dress. She moved through the crowd, distributing her sachets, playing her part. She was invisible to these people, just the help, the purveyor of quaint party favors. It allowed her to listen, to observe. She saw Robert's son, Evan, standing awkwardly by himself. He was in his late 20s, with his father's build but none of his bluster. He looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for an escape route. Clara watched him for a long time. He didn't seem to fit in this glittering world. Her opportunity came when she overheard a conversation between Robert and an associate. "The regulatory hearing is next month," the man said, his voice low. "The SEC is sniffing around those commercial real estate loans. You sure the books are clean?" Robert waved a dismissive hand. "It's handled, Paul. Evan's been going over everything with a fine-tooth comb. The kid's a pit bull. No imagination, but he's thorough. He'll make a presentation that will bore them into submission." He laughed, but it sounded forced. Clara's ears pricked up. SEC? Regulatory hearing? This was interesting. She continued her circuit, her mind racing. She needed to get closer to Evan. He was the key. He was the one with access, the one who seemed dissatisfied, the one Robert had just publicly diminished. Fate, or perhaps just good timing, intervened. As she passed a table laden with desserts, she saw Evan fumbling with a plate, trying to balance a glass of wine. He stumbled, and the wine sloshed, threatening to spill onto his white shirt. Without thinking, Clara reached out a steadying hand. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said, flustered. "No harm done," Clara said, her voice gentle. She took the glass from him and placed it safely on the table. These events are a minefield, aren't they? He looked at her, genuinely surprised by her kindness. You have no idea. I'd rather be anywhere else. I'm Clara Abernathy, she said, offering her hand. I provided the lavender. Evan Carson, he said, shaking her hand. His grip was firm, sincere. These are from you? He gestured to the sachet in his own pocket. They're wonderful. My mother. My real mother. She loved lavender. It reminds me of her. Clara's heart gave a small, unexpected lurch. Robert's first wife, Elizabeth, had been a gentle, quiet woman. Clara had liked her. She died of cancer when Evan was just a boy. It's a comforting scent, Clara said softly. It speaks of home, of simpler things. Evan's shoulders relaxed. Exactly. Not all. This. He gestured vaguely at the spectacle around them. They talked for 10 minutes. Clara asked him about his work at the bank, and he spoke with a quiet passion about risk assessment and ethical lending practices, things that sounded utterly anathema to his father's business model. He was idealistic, frustrated, and clearly living in the shadow of a giant. Sometimes I feel like I'm just polishing the brass on the Titanic, he confessed, then looked horrified he'd said it aloud. Clara just smiled. The most important work is often done below decks, out of sight. She excused herself soon after, not wanting to overplay her hand. But she had what she needed, a connection, a vulnerability. The next phase of her plan required capital. The motion to delay the foreclosure had bought her time, but it hadn't solved her debt problem. She needed money to fund her revenge. She looked around her beloved home. There was only one thing of real, liquid value left. 2 days later, a representative from Sotheby's stood in her living room, his eyes wide as he examined the small painting hanging over the fireplace. It was an original Willard Dixon landscape, a serene depiction of the Marin headlands at dawn. Thomas had bought it for her early in their marriage, when they were poor, and he'd somehow scraped together the money after a particularly good month. He'd said it reminded him of the future he wanted to give her. Peaceful, beautiful, expansive. It's exquisite, Mrs. Abernathy, the appraiser whispered. The market for Dixon's early work is very strong. It sold at auction a week later for a sum that made Clara's head spin. It was enough to pay off the outstanding loan and have a significant amount left over. She could have saved her home right then. She could have called Ben Jacobs and told him to cut a check to Silicon Valley United Bank. But she didn't. Instead, she paid off the loan, clearing the title to her property completely. The orange sign came down. Then she took the remainder of the money and opened a new private brokerage account. She was going to play Robert Carson at his own game. Using the snippet of information from the gala, she began to dig into Silicon Valley United Bank. She spent days in the depths of financial databases, SEC filings, and property records. Robert's bank had grown aggressively, specializing in loans for large commercial developments. One project kept popping up. The Atherton Heights Mall, a massive, controversial development on the site of an old landfill. The bank had a huge exposure on that loan. The developer was behind schedule, and there were whispers of environmental cleanup cost overruns. The stock price of the developer's company had been slowly, steadily declining. And then she found it. Buried in a footnote in a quarterly report was a mention of a series of complex credit default swaps the bank had taken out to insure itself against a default on the Atherton Heights loan. It was a risky, highly leveraged bet. If the mall project failed, the insurance payout would be enormous, but the reputational damage would be severe. Robert was playing a dangerous game, trying to hedge his own bad bet. But Clara saw a flaw. The insurance was through a subsidiary of a larger European bank, a subsidiary that was itself looking shaky based on some overseas market turmoil she'd been following. Robert thought he was insured. Clara suspected his insurance policy was worthless. This was her opening. Her revenge would not be a dramatic confrontation. It would be a financial one. She would make the bet that Robert Carson was too arrogant to make. She would short the stock of the mall developer, betting it would fail, and she would buy up the cheap, shaky debt of the European insurer, betting that when the call came for them to pay Robert, they would fail too. It was a house of cards, and she was going to blow on it gently from the sidelines. She invested every last penny from the painting into this intricate financial trap. Then she reached out to Evan Carson. She invited him to lunch at a quiet cafe in Sonoma, under the guise of wanting to pick the brain of a bright young banker about diversifying the assets from her recent lucrative sale of a family heirloom. He came, eager for a respite from his father's shadow. Over salads, she listened to him talk about his frustrations. She was a masterful listener, drawing him out with gentle questions. "My father thinks the Atherton Mall is a sure thing," Evan said, shaking his head. "He's so confident he's practically tied the bank's reputation to it. But the environmental reports, they're a mess. If the public finds out, the protests alone could sink it." "Wouldn't the insurance cover it?" Clara asked innocently. "The swaps? Yeah, but..." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I've been reviewing the counterparty risk on those. The insurer, Euro Credit Guarantee, their Baltic holdings are a black box. I tried to tell my father we need to dial back our exposure, but he just called me a worrywart." He laughed bitterly. "Said he didn't build an empire by being cautious." Clara's heart was pounding. She had been right. Evan had just confirmed everything. "A good leader listens to his team," Clara said softly, "especially to those who are cautious. Caution preserves empires. Arrogance destroys them." Evan looked at her with something like gratitude. I wish he saw it that way. Over the next few weeks, Clara and Evan met semi-regularly. She became a mentor figure, a sympathetic ear. She offered him the respect and intellectual engagement his father denied him. She never once spoke ill of Robert. She didn't have to. The contrast between her quiet wisdom and his father's bluster was lesson enough for Evan. Meanwhile, her financial bets began to pay off. News leaked about the environmental issues at the mall site. The developer's stock began to plummet. Clara's short position soared in value. Panicked, the developer turned to its insurer, Euro Credit Guarantee, to call on the credit default swaps. And just as Clara and Evan had feared, Euro Credit Guarantee collapsed under the weight of its other bad debts. It couldn't pay. The failure was front-page news. Silicon Valley United Bank was suddenly on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars in losses it had believed were insured. The bank's stock went into freefall. The SEC launched a full-scale investigation into the bank's risk management practices, the very hearing Robert had been so dismissive of. Clara watched from her veranda, sipping her tea, as the financial news channels dissected the collapse of Robert Carson's empire. She sold her positions at their peak. She was now quietly, immensely wealthy again. But financial ruin was only part of the plan. She needed the personal destruction. The final act came on the day of the SEC hearing. Robert was called to testify before Congress. He was combative, arrogant, blaming unforeseen market conditions and European incompetence. He was digging his own grave. Then it was Evan's turn to testify. He walked into the hearing room looking pale but determined. He caught his father's eye. Robert gave him a confident, almost imperious nod, expecting his son to toe the line, to help him spin the story. Evan looked at his father, and then he looked at the committee, and he began to speak. He didn't make excuses. He told the truth. He described his repeated warnings about the Atherton Mall project. He detailed his concerns about the insurer. He presented the internal memos he'd written, which his father had ignored. He spoke with a clarity and a moral authority that was utterly damning. He wasn't trying to save the bank. He was trying to save its soul. He was, in effect, publicly confirming that Robert Carson's arrogance and recklessness had destroyed the institution he'd built. Clara watched it all live on her laptop. She saw the look of utter betrayal on Robert's face, the crumbling of his smug confidence. It was the same look she had seen on Thomas's face all those years ago. It was perfect. The fallout was swift and brutal. Robert was forced to resign from the bank in disgrace. The Justice Department opened an investigation. His third wife, Chloe, filed for divorce almost immediately. His assets were frozen to cover the mounting lawsuits. He was utterly ruined. A week after the hearing, Clara received a visitor. She was in the distillery barn, checking on the new batch of oil, when she saw a car coming up the long driveway. It was Evan. He got out of the car, looking older and wearier than she'd ever seen him, but there was a new peace in his eyes. "Clara," he said. "Evan, come in. I just made some iced tea." They sat on the porch overlooking the lavender fields. The scent was heavy and sweet in the afternoon air. "I suppose you saw the news," he said finally. "I did," Clara said. "It was very brave, what you did." "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "After I talked to you, I realized that preserving a lie isn't loyalty. It's cowardice. My real mother. She would have wanted me to tell the truth." He looked out at the fields. "He's broke. He's lost everything. The house, the cars, everything. He's living in a rented apartment." Clara said nothing. She felt no triumph. She felt a quiet, profound sense of completion. "I'm leaving," Evan said. "Starting over. A small community bank in Oregon has offered me a job. I think I can do some good there." "I think you can too," Clara said sincerely. He stayed for a while longer, and when he left, he hugged her. "Thank you, Clara, for listening, for your advice. You helped me find my way." She watched him drive away, the dust settling behind his car. She thought of Thomas. She hoped, wherever he was, he could see this. He could see that the score had been settled, not with a sledgehammer, but with a scalpel, not with fury, but with patience and intelligence. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold that matched her fields. The lavender would be ready for harvest soon. The new Lavender Noir line was a roaring success. Her orders were fuller than ever. Her home was safe. Clara Abernathy, 67 years old, took a deep breath of the sweet, calming air. The war was over. She had won, and her victory, like her revenge, was absolutely perfect. The end.